Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our session this morning. We know it's early in the day. Maybe you haven't had enough coffee just yet, so hopefully this conversation can help lighten and wake up the room a little bit. So we wanted to start with a super light, super easy topic. Thank you. Around digital sovereignty. We've seen that it is very much in the headlines, certainly across Europe, in other jurisdictions as well, and felt perhaps it was a good time to take a pulse around what this discussion means, what it entails, and also try to make some connections between the level of discussions at a more political level through what it means in practice for organizations on the ground. So today with me I have three very different voices on the panel. Dr. Clément Perarnaud to my far right from the Brussels Schools of Governance at the VUB. Paul McDonough-Ford, Assistant Commissioner and Brussels-based attaché for the Irish Data Protection Commission. And to my right here, Thomas Bouet, VP and Director General for Policy EMEA at the Business Software Alliance. So through those different perspectives, we're hoping to talk about, again, sovereignty from different prisms, through different lenses, and as well compare and contrast what we all see from that theme across our various jobs and communities. So perhaps to get us started, Clément, I'm going to turn the first question to you and trying to set the scene a little bit for us around that concept of European digital sovereignty. It's not a new concept. It's been certainly discussed in Brussels for probably a solid 2 decades at least. But I'd love for you to give us your sense around how it has evolved in the past years and what do you see as the drivers, the main trends that are really picking up this year to get us started and set the scene for us.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Welcome, everyone. Very happy to be part of this panel, and thanks a lot again for the invitation. So I'll start with the first question on how it evolved over the years. So obviously, digital sovereignty means different things for different people. It is both an aspiration, a performative discourse. It is even a corporate strategy now for some. And so what we've seen over the years is clearly a shift from the contestation over the use itself. And now a contestation not necessarily about the use of digital sovereignty, but what it means in practice. What are the actual conditions for digital sovereignty? And that's what we're seeing, I think, nowadays. And in a nutshell, I see 3 debates now that are a bit punctuating the troubled history of digital sovereignty in the EU. One about the governance of digital sovereignty, so who gets to be digitally sovereign, whether the EU at the EU level or member state level. That's quite a protracted controversy nowadays. I see a discussion about what is the threat, the risk analysis that actually justify digital sovereignty policies, whether Russia, China, the US, or the big tech companies. And I think that explains why we have different approaches to digital sovereignty. And finally, maybe the most important thing, and one of the core debates nowadays around digital sovereignty policies, is about the openness of the European digital sector and to what extent, what should be the distance to, and the condition for non-EU actors to be part of the European digital sector. But that's, I guess, something that we're going to discuss further.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. And it's interesting that the 3 categories that you're putting out there. Maybe I want to pick on the second one, I think it was, around what is it, what are we going at exactly when we're talking about digital sovereignty in the European context? What is I think the word you used during our prep call was hegemony. Like, what is it that what is it that the European Union in its discussions around digital sovereignty is trying to combat or correct in your mind?
Yeah, so in the studies on digital sovereignty, so I'm an academic, a political scientist by heart, and it is often framed as a counter-hegemonic discourse, digital sovereignty. And so the hegemony that we're trying to contest, to combat, or to get stronger against can be in the context of the DMA, could be the US big tech. In the context of the DSA, it could be a bit different. I've studied, for instance, the sanctions on Russia. In the context of the fight against disinformation, and then in this context it would be a completely different hegemony that we're fighting. And I think this threat analysis is not shared by all the actors, and I explain in part why those digital sovereignty policies may be somehow incoherent in the end, and we may lack yeah, some coherency and consistency across the different sectors.
Yeah, and so you teed up perfectly the question I wanted to direct next to Thomas in terms of where we see sovereignty pop up. You've mentioned, Clément, a lot of different sort of policy areas or concepts that translate into legislation, just to keep the conversation at that level to start. Right now we hear a lot about cybersecurity, public procurement, obviously data transfers and personal data protection has been very high as well on that agenda around conceptualizing digital sovereignty. Thomas, where would you see the new sort of types of requirements or new trends are really picking up under this new mandate?
No, thank you, Isabel. And so at BSA, we represent enterprise software companies. So our members are large multinational companies that help organizations, businesses, governments manage their data in a variety of ways. So we're really in the sort of B2B space of things and helping with the digital transformation. I think what we've seen is that there's like a push-pull trend that is happening. On the one hand, it's like, oh, the EU, we need to digitalize more. Transformation using digital is essential for us, but we have to be very careful how we do that. And we have to really think about digital sovereignty. And I think Clément really mentioned it very well. I think there's not a single one definition of what it means. And according to who you talk to, then it means a lot of different things. And that creates a lot of uncertainties and a lot of tension sometimes that we see. I think one of the trends, the biggest trend that we're seeing is not so much necessarily, and I can talk about the legislation and the requirements that we're seeing, is also customers. What our companies hear from their customers, and customers have a variety of requirements or things that they think it would be important for them in terms of sovereignty. And sometimes it's data localization, sometimes it's having teams that will support their use of the technology that are based in Europe, or that. So a lot of things there that really is changing the way that businesses interact with their customers. And so there's no, in the B2B space, there's no off-the-shelf solutions. Everything is pretty much bespoke. But now the level of details in the bespoke solutions becomes even more important. And that is a reality that we're facing, that we're seeing. There's a few elements that we've seen that are interesting in the concepts of digital sovereignty, which is not trying to define it as such, because I think we cannot really do that, but have what DG Digit did back in November last year, or October, with their cloud sovereignty framework, where they analyze, I think it's like 7 or 8 different levels of sovereignty. And so it would be left up to, in this case, procurers of technology, but it can be left up to customers, to say, hey, listen, I want to make sure that in these levels, like there's a certain level of requirements that I think are what I need for what I think is digital sovereignty. I think one of the things that is clear in that sovereignty framework is that achieving true sovereignty, true independence is impossible in the tech world, because there's one thing that is, global is chips. Chips, there's not a single entity and region in the world that can make up chips on their own. And we need Europeans, we need an American, and we need, Asian partners. So if we're thinking that we're going to achieve full sovereignty, I think we all are, in for a ride.
So the cloud framework that you referenced indeed has 6 or 7 categories, and it's quite interesting to see how perhaps broadened they have been compared to where we started the conversation around sovereignty a few years ago, where we do see, and I think Paul mentioned that in his remarks, actually, we do see sustainability becoming increasingly an element of how to assess, evaluate a digital sovereignty fitness check of sorts. So I'm curious about, and you alluded to that, on the complexity that this creates for operators. Obviously, your members are probably big multinational, but there's sort of an ecosystem around that. Can you maybe explain a little bit more, give a bit more color to what it means in practice? You talked about fragmentation or friction or increased cost, but also how does that relate to the customer expectations that probably also come in a lot of different shades? Can you just expand a little bit on that?
Sure, happy to. And then you mentioned something interesting. I think, if you think, sustainability, how does that factor into the concept of sovereignty? And I think, an easy shortcut to take in this one is to say, well, we feel sometimes, or some policymakers feel, that Europe has an advantage in terms of sustainability, in terms of greening technologies or pushing for that, and that would be a thing to favor some homegrown companies or homegrown industries that would be better. But for our members, the difficulties to make sure that customers get what they want when it's actually feasible, right? So for instance, they are, a lot of our companies are running, and they were mostly SaaS companies, right? So they operate on infrastructure, cloud providers, right? And there are not many of them that have a global reach. And if you are a company in Europe that has customers all around the world, even if you're an SME, today you can reach pretty much the world, then you need to have a global reach, right? And so there's companies develop their SaaS to run on infrastructure providers. They have a multi-cloud approach. They work with few others, but there are not that many that are interchangeable. And so if a customer comes in and says, well, listen, we would like you run your SaaS on our local cloud provider, maybe that is not something that is possible. Technically, not because there's no willingness to do that, but because the cost of engineering that transformation, that transition, would be prohibitive and would not make sense in that context, right? So what we're seeing, one of the trends of sovereignty that you talked about, that I think we've seen we've seen some companies now being reluctant to move to the cloud and asking some of our companies to run all their software on premise. Which brings us back to the 1990s and 1980s, and that actually is something that is difficult. And for some software, it's possible, but for a lot of others that are developed being seen as in the cloud, and it won't be possible. So that means that in practice, customers may get not the state-of-the-art technology, or not the latest versions, and that is actually a hindrance and a problem.
Okay. Paul, let me bring you in now and bringing a bit of a regulator's view on how we're discussing this. Obviously, not all aspects of digital sovereignty that we've touched on fall under a data protection authority's mandate, but a lot of it sort of probably crosses your desk in one way or another. And what we're describing here is happening not in a vacuum, but in an environment in which DPAs have already produced a lot of guidance, opinions. Sort of there's a jurisprudence already applying to all of this. So I'm curious about sort of how that debate of digital sovereignty sort of fits into your work, and how does it color the work that you do as a regulator, but also how does the existing corpus that we're operating under now fits with those sort of evolutions and trends that we see coming up? Easy question for you, Paul.
Yeah, great, and thanks a lot, Isabel, and great to be here as well and join you all on the panel. The first thing maybe to say is from the perspective of a regulator, from the perspective of a DPA, we're enforcing at the moment the GDPR as we find it, and there may be further developments in the future that would colour what we have to do. In some ways, the introduction of maybe in the future specific or prescriptive obligations, an analogy that came to mind was, what we'll see in the AI Act, where some practices are just prohibited in a particular way, would make the practical life of a regulator a bit easier in that sense. At the moment, what comes to mind from a GDPR perspective is obviously the impact of some of our decisions in litigation on cross-border data transfers, and in particular, we are seeing now in challenges to our decisions. An example is one that's it's ongoing litigation in relation to our decision on TikTok and the transfer of personal data to China, that a huge amount of the factual and practical debate around that decision, which of course we stand over and we view we interpreted the law correctly, the debate is around data localization and the fact that a lot of organizations in practice are now engaging in data localization in Ireland, and the question that the DPC had to decide on is how does that, under the GDPR, interact with remote access in this situation to the personal data in China. And in relation to your question about, I guess, the guidance and corpus that exists on that particular issue, we have seen that in member states, some national courts, as they're entitled to do, have taken a slightly different approach to that issue, in particular of localization and remote access. as we understand it. And so that's something at the moment that we will probably need clarity on in the ongoing litigation, and we hope that our interpretation will ultimately be ruled correct by the courts. But that's a way, I think, in which DPAs are now having to be brought into that political aspect of the debate around data localization, even if the actual theoretical legal decision that they're taking in relation to the law on data transfers at the moment has nothing in particular to say about that, provided, it becomes a question of whether does the jurisdiction have adequacy or does it not, and if it doesn't, are they complying with the other aspects of the GDPR that they need to in order to make those the protection of personal data essentially equivalent. But as I say, maybe as a regulator, we will be enforcing the law as we find it. And at the moment, as we say, and always say, if an entity is made established in Ireland, it doesn't matter at the moment, in principle, whether they are US or whether they're Chinese or whether they're European, will be enforcing and upholding the GDPR in exactly the same way until such time as there are substantive changes to the law on that, if there will be.
Follow-up question looking at another important aspect of your work around enforcement. Where do you see that some of those sovereignty-driven priorities may fit into the work that you do under the supervision enforcement piece of your work? Do you see that some areas are more likely to come up in that context? What would they be? Can you give us a sense of what it might be a bit of a crystal ball exercise there, but I'm just curious about how that type of debate might inform that aspect of the work of regulators, whether from an Irish perspective or more European level, if you care to comment on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's not a slight cop-out to your question, but the first obvious thing that comes to mind is we're a public sector body, so we have to think a lot about public procurement. And the actual software that we're using day to day, and the software that any public sector body would be using into the future, whether that's in the context of kind of office software, but also as we see more and more embracing now of AI by the public sector, and then moving into that. Something that's significant for the DPC that maybe doesn't cut through internationally as much is we also enforce very robustly against the public sector in Ireland. We've seen some high-profile cases previously in relation to, for example, ID cards, and we're one of the data protection authorities that can also fine public sector bodies, and we've done so quite a few times in the past. So maybe something like moving away from data transfers, maybe these issues around public procurement is something that we could see definitely arising in the future if there were some requirements on that, and it's something we could imagine we would be brought into. That's probably a significant example that comes to mind. But again, as it's a crystal ball exercise, it's difficult to know exactly what would happen. I mean, in an Irish specific context, and this is not something, of course, we would either be taking a view on or necessarily have to enforce on directly, but you're working in a backdrop as well where we're one of the jurisdictions where this idea of data localization and also data centers is becoming a political issue, both from a sustainability perspective, but also given we happen to have some of the highest wholesale electricity costs in Europe. So that's something that cuts through definitely in the public debate as well, even if it's, of course, not something that we're directly involved in. So I'm sure that will continue to be the case.
Just want to jump back on what Paul just said at the moment on procurement, because this is an area we're starting to see a lot of things happening as well. And as mentioning, the sovereignty framework that GTG is working, but also there's a few things that will happen, at European level in terms of legislation. The Cloud and AI Development Act, the Public Procurement Directive review that will happen this summer, and we know that there's a lot of discussions, a lot of tensions in this space as to how and where do we draw the line and what do we do. I think what we've seen, in many ways over the last few years is moving away in the context of procurement, to move from technical criteria to criteria that are much more political and much more sensitive, right? So like some of them are, where does the CEO of your company live? what does it matter in the terms of procurement? We're looking for, technologies, security, resilience, reliability. The location of the headquarters of the CEO is irrelevant, but this increasingly becoming, part of the discussions, part of the debates. And there's one thing that we also need to remember, which is we just said earlier, like, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? The EU has international commitments on, the WTO GPA rules, and I think these are the things that, as policymakers think of these things, like, they need to think of, hey, we need to make sure that we create a framework that actually is also internationally consistent and coherent with our own obligations.
Clément, I saw you nod at some of the things that Paul was saying around public procurement as well. I don't know if you wanted to come in as well and comment on that.
Maybe to come back to one of your questions, like what is the direction for the requirement that will be imposed on the different actors? Clearly, it's towards more prescriptiveness, I would argue, and in the legislation that are coming to the agenda, such as the tech sovereignty package, and many others, including the Public Procurement Act. That's clearly something that we are going to see. Even in more arcane issues, such as post-quantum encryption, you see a direction towards probably imposing a bit more directly certain standards from the EU level, or at least EU-supported standards. And in the MFF, clearly in the context of the Competitiveness Fund, you will probably see a bit more prescriptiveness towards digital sovereignty solutions, which, as was explained a bit earlier, are not so clear as to what do we actually mean, except for the framework when it comes to cloud sovereignty, where there is at least a bit of a direction. We are unclear for the other important issues.
So some uncertainties certainly, but when I hear the mention of standards, for example, or frameworks, in my mind, it also resonates with, well, that's actually goalposts that are factual, that are concrete, that are tangible for organization to gear towards and be in a position of ticking boxes in an easier way, in a way that's maybe more pragmatic. Is there any sort of positive development that you see as well in that space that can actually alleviate some of the difficulties that you've mentioned around friction, uncertainty, disparities, like anything that you would qualify as a positive or helpful development in that area? Whether standards, that's the one that was mentioned, but certainly sort of beyond that as well.
Personally, I do see it. I mean, the objective of those legislation is actually to create frictions, and so in a sense, their very purpose is to create this type of legal and economic friction. So in a sense, I think they do what they are supposed to do to some extent. In my work, I'm looking at the concept of internet fragmentation, try to reflect on what are the long-term implications of those policy developments. And so I try to reflect on how EU digital sovereignty approach intersect with other policy fields, such as internet governance, and to what extent we can actually reconcile the position of the EU when it comes to internet governance and its own internal position when it comes to digital markets and the digital economy. And there I don't see much of an overlap, and I see quite an intense policy tension that is yet to be resolved, and the position of the EU when it comes to global standardization in particular. We've seen that with ETSI, with Sensenelec, and in other private standardization body, is really inconsistent, and I think it's actually to the detriment of digital sovereignty overall. So I think that's something that we see in the context of the AI Act with Sensenelec, but in many other policy fields, including post-quantum encryption that I talked about just before.
Did you want to comment? We can maybe, did you want to comment on that? No. I wanted to pivot maybe more towards the simplification debate that we're having here, and sort of piggybacks on some of your last comments, Clément, as well, where we do have this very clear leadership objective from the European Commission in part to push a simplification agenda, not a deregulatory agenda, but a simplification agenda that makes it easier to comply with existing rules and to implement existing legislation. But what we're hearing here is also that it leaves next to a policy objective around digital sovereignty that does inherently create friction, complexity. And so I'm curious about your view about how those two live next to one another, with each other, in opposition to one another. Is there a tension between that appetite for sovereignty, for control, and the objective of simplification? Anybody wants to give it a go? Would love to hear you three on that one.
Sure, I'll start. I think, I mean, it's a perfect storm, right? So we're doing simplification, we're doing digital sovereignty all at the same time, while we're still trying to ensure also that we create economic growth in Europe that is hardly missing, right? So we're trying to like put in the efforts finally of the Draghi report into practice with all of that, where there's a misconception by a variety of stakeholders as to what simplification is about. And I think you mentioned that very well, which is our perspective, which is to say, simplification is not deregulation, but we need to make sure that the corpus of EU laws that is applied to digital, at least in our sector, is consistent, coherent, and does not overlap. I'll give you an example, which is on incident notification, right? So if you're a cloud company, a cloud operator, and there's an incident that happens in your system, you are subject of 5 different legislations that have 5 different definition of what is an incident. You have potentially 3 or 4 regulators. You have 3 or 4 different timelines for reporting and 3 or 4 or 5 different templates for reporting. Now, that is extremely complex. If you're a responsible company that says, well, I want to make sure that first I protect my customers' data, I inform the regulator, I work with the regulator to find a solution, you spend time just dealing with the paperwork of trying to figure that out, because the definitions also don't match. You have some is significant incidents, others is serious incidents. And if you look at the wording, they are actually completely different. And that is a real problem if you really want to comply with that. Now, the Commission has decided to try to simplify all of that. And what they come up with, which is a very simple idea, which is say, let's create one single point of contact for all these notifications. So we don't change the definitions, we don't change the timelines, we don't change the templates, we don't change anything, but at least you have one regulator towards to, or one letterbox to do that. Well, that's a baby step, right? So it's nothing that's going to really make or break anything. It's just a baby step. But then you start seeing member states in council, and the Cypriot presidency is very, guilty of that, of saying, no, we're going to lose some sovereignty because there's not going to be whoever we decide that's going to. So we need to really recreate and refragment this thing. So we are not making any progress. We're just making the lives of companies that actually want to comply with whatever so much harder. And so, and does that bring more sovereignty? I don't think so. Does that bring more security? I don't think so. It just brings more confusion, and actually is not helping any company that can try to enter the market and try to figure all that over themselves. So I think we are in this very difficult situation where all of these issues happen all at once, and we cannot be. We're not able to take them one by one and work them out for what they are, and try to ensure that we actually simplify to help, because this will. I won't say it would augment sovereignty as in itself, certainly, but at least it will bring much more clarity and much more security in the marketplace.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in on that as well. Speaking back to what Thomas was just saying, it brought to mind something that's really been, I think, to the forefront for us as a data protection authority in the last couple of years, and that's first of all, being part of an initiative that's also happening at EDPB level, and we're obviously a very active member of the EDPB, which is to try and address a lot of the feedback we've received from stakeholders about the fact that despite the fact we have a direct effect regulation applying in the entire EU, there does appear to be some fragmentation in practice on the ground, either in terms of how individual provisions of the law are being applied, or how stringently things are being applied in practice. Some people might be familiar with the EDPB's Helsinki Declaration, which the DPC strongly supported, and that committed to also working to try and deal with these issues in practice. But also one of the ways in which we will now have to deal with this is by having very, very close cooperative relationships with regulators in other spheres. So the DPC is a very active member of the Irish Digital Regulators Group, which is a group that meets regularly to try and address exactly these kind of issues and how we can work together to deal with those kind of matters where we will need to cooperate. It happens in the cyberspace, but also in the context of, for example, media regulation and the DSA. Also, of course, a lot of gatekeepers under the DMA also have their GDPR main establishment in Ireland, and there's a huge interregulatory cooperation area there. And there are also, I mean, there are entire teams working on this. We have an entire team who work full-time now on interregulatory matters, or interregulatory affairs, as we call it, and working with other non-data protection regulators. But on that idea and the question of fragmentation, and also on a tension between sovereignty on the one hand and simplification, we come up against practical issues sometimes. To give one example of something that maybe isn't an instinctive digital sovereignty example, but it is an issue of a tension around territoriality and the GDPR. We had a case of a Canadian company, it appears to be quite a small company, out, and we received complaints about them because they appeared to essentially be using AI to scrape the internet to then create a database of lawyers all over the world. We had some complaints from Irish lawyers saying, what's all this about? And I wouldn't like this being on the internet. And it gave rise to practical difficulties because this was a very small entity that has, to say nothing of an establishment, they don't have an Article 27 representative in Ireland. There's nobody jurisdictionally to enforce against, despite the fact that the GDPR applies. And despite, again, the fact that they did their very best to help us, the Canadian DPA is only competent for the public sector. So we're still trying to figure out a way to deal with those complaints because there's no apparent legal avenue that we can use, despite the fact that the GDPR very much does apply to processing like that. So that there are practical problems that we still see sometimes.
I want to put a pin in that, in the international collaboration, and come back to it. But Clément, maybe you want to comment as well on that sort of tension between sovereignty and simplification currently in the EU policy debate.
Sure. So on this connection between the simplification agenda, especially in the context of the digital and this broader EU digital sovereignty agenda, I see a rather tenuous connection, but what I fear the most is that the confusion that Thomas was mentioning, especially with the reform of the definition of what is meant by personal data, or the legal grounds for the use of sensitive data, may puzzle a bit probably global partners, and also the vision and the message that the EU was defending somehow towards third countries. So I wonder whether this could create more confusion. Sometimes we don't only refer to digital sovereignty as the capacity to act autonomously, but also the ability to have a form of actorness globally. And in this particular dimension, I wonder whether this simplification package would affect this form of digital sovereignty. So this is to be seen, but and the digital omnibus negotiations are still ongoing. But the initial proposal, at least for this particular omnibus, are a bit worrying, I would say, for this particular aspect.
Interesting. Piggyback on, Paul, your comment around international collaboration. Lots to unpack there as well. But I think you've all mentioned in the course of your remarks that we're very much operating in a cross-border international concept, whether as a company, whether as a regulator. All of those are really sort of living in a world, in a borderless world. Paul, you mentioned some of the collaboration groupings that we see emerging, certainly among regulators. The EDPB has probably been one of the first bodies to do that in a privacy context, but increasingly we see cooperation of regulators across sort of digital domains, and you've mentioned some of the areas that come up in that context. But if we look at this international conversation that has to happen as well around those issues. There's going to be a few questions into one here, so I'll let you choose which part you want to respond to. But how much alignment are we seeing in just starting at a basic level around the definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about sovereignty? I think, Clément, you mentioned sort of some of the friction here in the EU's own position between the sort of inward-looking versus outward-looking dimension there. So is there some alignment globally on how we're defining the term sovereignty? I imagine the answer might be no, but would love to, beyond the simple answer here, sort of unpack that, what that actually means. And again, with the notion of, if we're operating in a world internationally, what does that mean for organizations in terms of navigating that landscape, in terms of finding solutions, and also for regulators? Do you see any creative solutions that are coming up from using that collaboration internationally? So there's a lot of elements there. Maybe, I don't know if one of you wants to start with sort of the, what does that conversation look globally? Do we see pockets of like-minded countries that are gearing towards the same notion of digital sovereignty, or is the fragmentation such that there's really very little alignment globally?
Okay, I'll start. There's no alignment globally. I think if you go to some parts of the world and you hear digital sovereignty, it's like if you had a red drape and they were a bull. They go berserk because they feel that it's a total protectionist and anti-name the country, companies. So I think there's digital sovereignty. I think we just keep going around in circles talking about this, but there's no one single definition. And people who know me know I'm blunt. Some countries in the EU see that as a real industrial policy. Their ambition is to say, well, we need to help our companies to grow and to be part of the digital world. They are nowhere today, or they're very low market shares, we need to help them. And for that, we're going to use digital sovereignty as a beacon to exclude others from participating in tenders, in market, etc. That's pretty simple as that. Other countries are much more like, well, actually, it goes beyond that. Sovereignty is really making sure that we have control, we can decide what we want when we want for the purpose that we want, which is totally acceptable and totally understandable. But because there's no agreement as to what exactly it means, that's why we're seeing all the different discussions we're having, all the different criteria that are being discussed. So we're not discussing a single definition, we're discussing criteria to achieve sovereignty, and each country, organization will decide where the markers go, right? And that's just for Europe. I mean, if you go, across the Atlantic, there's no discussion of sovereignty. Nobody cares about that. On the contrary, they sometimes get pretty anxious about it. In APAC, APAC is a very diverse region. It's not like the EU. We talk APAC like the EU, but it's very different. It's different languages, different legal systems, different regimes, different, levels of economy, even more disparate than the EU. And for them, they're looking at the EU and thinking like, well, what are we doing? And so they're trying to, most of the time, copy what we're doing, in a variety of different ways, but with their own flavor. And so that will create a huge patchwork of things. So I think what we need to do is to go and work for a more global convergence, how we achieve, some sort of standards on, on cyber, on data governance, on, anything that you can have, but working with partners as opposed to trying to say, well, this is our vision and we're going to force feed that onto the rest of the world.
Yeah, I can come in on that as well. I mean, I think it's quite clear, even if you read the debate that's out there publicly, that it depends on who's speaking as to what digital sovereignty precisely means. Maybe we will get legal clarity on it in the near future, but at the moment the question is, are you talking about whether it's, for example, a European company or not, and what does it mean to be a European company? Does it simply mean that you're incorporated in a jurisdiction in the EU? It seems probably not, based on the way some people are discussing it. Is it then about the cloud infrastructure, the data centers, or is it about something beyond that? And then it seems to depend again on political views. So that kind of remains to be seen. But again, from the perspective of a regulator, something that we are seeing where there's interplay between a lot of different legislative change that impacts digital regulation, what we're trying to do also at European level is work kind of, to use the jargon, vertically and horizontally. So that includes, as a member of the EDPB, with the European Commission, and now where there is some interplay with the GDPR and other digital regulation, the EDPB and the European Commission are now producing joint guidelines on that point to make sure that everybody is on the same page and everybody's clear about the views of each stakeholder in that regulation. And I think at the DPC we think that's a particularly welcome development, because it enables the views of all sides to be kind of put out there as early as possible, and then also to hold public consultations and to get the views of all who are impacted by it before those documents are finalised, or I think in some cases before even pen is put to paper on first drafts. So I think going forward, if there were further changes in this area, that's probably a model we should definitely stick to kind of get as much clarity on definitions as possible when we've got something to maybe a little bit more to work from.
Maybe on the topic of the coalitions, at least at the EU level, you see the revival of a coalition called the Digital 9 Plus or Digital 9 in the Council. I have studied that in the context of a free flow of data regulation back in 2018. And so in recent years, you see the revival of this format, which is led by countries such as, I don't know, Sweden, Ireland, and the Netherlands, for instance. And they frame digital sovereignty in a way that aligned with what we call market cosmopolitanism. I'll find the right word in a second. And as opposed to the French, the German, and a few others that are pushing for another form of digital sovereignty that is more neo-mercantilist in the sense that it's pushing for actual economic nationalism. And you see this battle happening at the level of the Council that is not only true for the EU, but more broadly at the global level. This conversation as to what is the future of the globalization and as a result of the geopolitics that we know of today.
Can you expand a little bit on those two concepts, the neo-capitalism and the cosmo?
So neo-mercantilist policies is basically
what does that lead to in terms of like concrete measures, for example?
Well, that's precisely what we're seeing nowadays, basically trying to foster a European sector, strengthen European companies as opposed to third countries and other companies, whereas a few other member states, including the Netherlands and a few others, are trying still to push for the agenda of yesterday, let's say, to some extent, and pushing for the global norms and global trade and the WTO rules. That I think we are slowly moving past to some extent.
Okay. Thank you. Did you want to come back?
I just want to add to what Clément is saying. I think you're right. It's like two visions that are like fighting with one another. And I think one of the things that is really key in this space is helping to create competition or facilitating competition in global markets is extremely important. And I think any company will want that because it helps them getting more stimulation, more innovation. And the more we do that, the better it is, and the better customers ultimately benefit. And customers, be they citizens or be they other companies, from the competition, because you cannot rest on your laurels. Now, artificially skewing competition by excluding some providers from the market because of nationality or other like non-objective criteria is actually doing the opposite, because you're actually like stifling innovation and you're actually creating products that are more expensive, less advanced, and that everybody loses out. I think we're, in our membership, we have European, we have American, and we have Japanese companies, and all of them look at sovereignty in a sort of relative positive way, because I think we're always looking at the positive, but sometimes we're looking at some of the protectionist elements in some of the sovereignty debates as really concerning, and especially our European companies saying like, hang on a second, we cannot go this way, because if we do that, then we, even though we're European or headquartered in the EU, we will be losing out very much, because there's so many things that we still cannot comply on. Like some artificial criteria being thought about, our sovereignty is, the capitalization of a company, market capitalization. Companies traded on the stock exchange, how can you ensure that they are still European if they are traded globally? And I think these are questions that we need to ask ourselves as to what exactly that we want. I think the point that Clément raises is absolutely right. Like, what kind of future do we want? Do you want cosmopolitanism with like global competition, global trends, global views, or like neo-mercantilism where we actually artificially create it's not even competition, it's like alternatives that actually will replace functioning, existing, and well-established market players?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, so I want to maybe bring in the audience at this point. If there's any questions from anyone in the room, I think we might have microphones. But if anybody has a question they would like to put to our panelists. Okay, no problem. I still have a couple in store. One is actually maybe, oh, I'm sorry, Matthew, go ahead.
Hi there. Matthew Newman from MLEX. I wonder, Thomas, if you could elaborate a little bit more on your point about public procurement and in particular about what's being discussed in Brussels today and in the coming weeks on the tech sovereignty package, which has been delayed till June 3rd. How, in your mind, is this a problem for the WTO's GPA? Where could it run into potential issues with our partners, Europe's partners around the world? Where's the conflict? Could it end up as a WTO case if it's not worded correctly? Or should it just be avoided altogether to start messing around with the public procurement rules? If you could just kind of outline a little bit the problem with the GPA.
Sure, thanks, Matthew. As I was saying, there's a different variety of ways where procurement is being looked at in upcoming legislation. Some of it is in CAIDA, some of it would be in the public procurement. One of the elements that we've seen that is really interesting is the Industrial Accelerator Act that was just published a few months ago, which is. And there was a lot of discussion, within the Commission before it came to being released as to what exactly are we going to do in this space. And this concerns, like energy and turbines and a bunch of sectors that are not to do with digital. But the intention there was to look at how sovereignty would play in that space and how we could try to have, depending on who you talk to, made in Europe or made with Europe. And I think these are two radically different ways of looking at things. And I think obviously. Our preference is always to made with Europe, like European partner and collaborate and work with others. But anyways, the way that the Commission has actually looked at the Industrial Accelerator Act is to say, well, listen, so we're gonna make sure that in procurement for these sectors that are identified in scope, we will be looking at products that are made with Europe. And made European, in Europe with Europe. And how do we define Europe? Is we define the European Union, the European Economic Area, but also we have a list of countries that are part of the WTO GPA agreements on GPA's General Procurement Agreement and the WTO, where countries that are signatories to this, agree that they will open the public procurements to the other signatories to the agreements, without discrimination, except when there's and you have the trade language of, the normal, necessary, exclusion. And I think and what the Commission has done in that space to say, well, we're creating a whitelist, so countries that with whom the EU has, GPA, then they are considered to be part of the EU, and therefore they will be able to be tendering, et cetera, and that is actually opens up the door for global collaboration with partners that are not based in the geographical area of the EU, right? And there was a lot of tensions within the Commission as to, no, do we make a whitelist, like an opt, out, so that we already have these countries in, and the Commission can take them out if they want to, or do we actually do an opt-in, which is everybody's out unless the Commission decides to enter their in? And I think we feel that what the Commission did in that instance to have this opt-out is the right thing to do, and we hope to see that being replicated in legislation such as CAIDA, such as the public procurement, because that also would be consistent with our commitments. And again, but the jury is still out because the IAA just was released. It's going to go through the process, and we know there are forces, at play that will try to restrict access to non-EU companies to the market. But anyways, at least the intention, I think what we can see and what we can, because like on a broader points, the Commission and President von der Leyen at least, they have this sort of vision of what the EU should be in the world, even with regard to sovereignty, which is a very open and to what Clément was saying before, much more cosmopolitan. And I think that if we follow this path, I think we can achieve some sort of sovereignty, but in a much more pragmatic and peaceful way.
Yeah, just to add one thing, maybe moving from the European level to a national level as well. Obviously, Matthew's question referenced WTO cases. I can also, be quite confident that irrespective of what changes are made to public procurement law, it would inevitably result in practice in domestic litigation across Europe for individual public sector bodies as well. That's something that we see already as a regulator. It's obviously the norm that plenty of individual organizations might decide to litigate if their bid is not successful in a public sector procurement context. And if there are disputes as to the interpretation of particular legislation or facts on the ground in terms of whether a particular organization respects digital sovereignty or not, then we will probably get a lot of member state litigation as well. And I think in any change in the law, that's sort of inevitable, and we'll probably have plenty of colleagues that need to work on it. I was advised when I started working in DPC's legal team, if you know anything about public procurement, maybe don't advertise it, or suddenly you'll only end up working on public procurement, and maybe people won't be able to get away with that approach in the future if it's really coming to the front and center now. But I just thought I'd add it. We'll see it on national level as well, I think.
Yeah, which is why, just to Paul's point, I think that's why in procurement you need to focus on technical criteria. You need to be as objective as possible in the way that you actually weigh and look at tenders. Because if you start having criteria that are loosely worded or that are more political in nature, then you open the door to this kind of litigation that I think nobody ever wants to see through. But so it's really about if you get it right at the start, with the way that you write the tenders, then you can avoid a lot of problems down the line.
And in that space, Paul, the EDPB has done some work in the coordinated enforcement framework action, was it 3-4 years ago, I guess, around cloud procurement in the public sector as well. So there's sort of clearly been some assessment, evaluation and actions following that as well. Clément, did you want to comment on the public procurement aspect? Okay. Do we have other questions maybe from the audience? Yes, I see a question in the back.
Thank you. Jaap Koopman from the Radboud University, the Netherlands. A question to all three. Does it still make sense as Europe to stick to this cosmopolitan, free competition kind of stance if we see that the end result of that has been that the winners of that position have been largely big tech companies in the US, combined with the fact that this cosmopolitan dream, the fact that all these different countries in the world operate according to this principle, is clearly no longer valid given the way the US has acted over the last few years, the way that China acts. So does it really, aren't we putting up ourselves as Europe to be very weak if we still stick to this old dream of globalization and cosmopolitanism, if all these other geopolitical regions do not stick to this anymore?
So I think starting point is, and the reason why we're having all this discussion and what the EU is doing at the moment is to try to ensure that we actually grow as a continent, right? It's all about economic growth, it's about prosperity. And think that we are slumping and we've been not being too bad. And there's two ways to actually enhance. I mean, there's more ways, but like take two quick examples. But two ways to grow your economy. Either you develop technology that you then make a market leader in developing the technology and diffusing that all around the world, or you actually integrate that in your economy to the extent that you actually use that to actually grow. And you can do both, but you do one or the other. I think what we've seen is in the context of digital technologies, the EU is not necessarily a leader in developing the technology for a variety of different reasons that have nothing to do with anything but regard to sovereignties, market realities. It's about investments, it's about access to finance, it's about labor laws. It's a variety of things. That's totally fine. But then the way that to actually benefit from it is like, can we diffuse that into our economy? And at the moment, we're looking at the problem the right way, which is to say, well, our economies and our prosperity is really difficult. We need to use technology to actually achieve that, but we're not going to be using other people's technology. We're going to try to recreate our own with less means, with less time, and that is where I think we are creating a very difficult situation for ourselves. So I don't know if it's to the question you're actually asking, which is like, should we keep this dream alive of we want to? Yes, I think we should, because at the end of the day, the alternative of us trying to redo what already exists, what already out there, is too high, the cost is too high, and we won't achieve that in any way, shape, or form. So it's either us losing the race or actually trying to at some point make sense of it all.
Do either of you want to add as well?
Yeah, on the question, the sudden realization that public procurement are actually really powerful levels of powers. I think this realization was made in the US or China really early on. There is this great book from Linda Weiss called The National Security State, where you see how this US technology landscape actually being built through public procurement. And I think this realization is now, I think, also being made in the context of the EU. The only limit is to what extent it is actually overlapping or challenging the very rules that the global economy is supposed to be following. This is to be seen. But I just wanted to some extent, agree with the question in the sense that those public procurements have been levels of control, and the very reason why those US big tech actually came to be. And I think this is why public procurements are actually features in proposals such as the Eurostack and many others. And but the conditions for this public procurement to be successful ways to achieve digital sovereignty for me are not so clear. And this is a work that we will be discussing, I think, in the coming days.
So I think we're slowly coming to the end of the time here. So maybe as a forward-looking question, well, looking at history to inform the future in a way. Again, the sovereignty agenda is not new. It's been a topic of discussion in the European circles for the better part of 2 decades. There's been attempts. There's probably been some progress made in achieving some of the results. But if it's still an item of political will, it means that we haven't reached the objective that was set in the first place. So I guess my question, and asking to fit into your closing remarks here, is around looking at some of the actions that have been taken so far, some of the attempts that have been made, any lessons learned on what might actually work this time, why is it different this time that may actually be more successful, again, in achieving that vision of digital sovereignty? Where do you see, success in that space in the next few weeks, months, years, whatever the horizon is for you? Paul, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, that makes me think of, so the DPC is a member of an organization called the International Age Assurance Working Group, and that includes EU and non-EU member states. So I just some like the UK, Australia, the Philippines, South Africa, and that's something that we're seeing. We're not sure yet where that's going to land politically in the EU and also some other member states. But I think it's becoming clear that whenever a decision is made about age assurance or anything to do with age, and I'm not just speaking about social media here, because a lot of the discussions are about other types of age assurance for various apps and online services as well. And I think once that technology is there, by the way, it would probably, in practice, be tricky to limit it just to social media. However, we've seen, for example, in the UK recently, Ofcom, the British media regulator, have been issuing fines for access that, where I believe the entity that was fined in question would allege the people who are accessing the content were using VPNs. So you're seeing a lot of practical ways to circumvent things like that if there are no decisions on global alignment. So if there was a political landing point on that, that's probably an example of something where I could see success in sort of dealing with fragmentation while also respecting sovereign rights of individual countries to make decisions like that.
Clément, do you want to share your views on what success might look like?
Maybe what I'm following the most when it comes to the digital sovereignty conversation is how to not only think about digital sovereignty from a state's perspective, but also think about digital sovereignty from the perspective of the individual, the consumer, and various marginalized communities. And that's maybe something that is missing in this conversation on digital sovereignty, even though there is quite a large literature on digital sovereignty of indigenous communities, for instance. And I try to follow all those movements that are pushing for alternative ways to think about digital sovereignty and try to really take it from the individual standpoint or the community standpoint, so as to maybe go against those power dynamics that are fostering more and more concentration from the state and industry perspective.
I think, as I said, for us, digital sovereignty, it should be about ensuring that customers have control, they have resilient system, they have state-of-the-art technology. And I think for us, looking ahead, and we just put out a paper a few months ago on our vision for digital sovereignty for Europe is keeping the door open, trying to make sure that they work with like-minded partners, companies, organizations, as again, one should not conflate the place where a company is headquartered with that country's government. These companies are the mouthpiece of the governments, and the government does not represent necessarily the views of these companies. So I think making sure that companies, and I think I'll end on this quote from President von der Leyen when in February 2020. When the first digital package came out from her first commission, she defined digital sovereignty as the ability and the rights of the EU to legislate in ways that is compatible with our legal system, with our values, and with the way that we see things. If companies respect those rules, then they are welcome to play here. And I think that is a way that we think is the right approach to deal with digital sovereignty, is to make sure that you bring in people to work on helping the EU according to whatever they want to achieve. Now, if you take that and you create the policies to exclude others, then actually we'll be going against the wall, and I think that would be a real huge problem. So I think the more open, the more transparent, the more collaborative we are, I think the more we can certainly achieve that objective, for all of us.
Well, thank you very much. It was a really, really interesting debate. Thank you on behalf of the IPP for joining this session, and to all of you for listening and joining in. If you want to help me thank our panelists this morning, thank you.